I think it's incredibly difficult at the moment to have any conversation around any hot topic. And I think that's because people have become entrenched. Society's so polarized at the moment. You're either on this camp or that camp.
Hello everyone and welcome to Not the Easy Way. My name is Dr. Peter DeLima and I'm here with the lovely Dr. Claire McGuiggan. Today our very special guest is Calvin Robinson. Calvin Robinson was a previous computer science teacher, assistant principal and school governor. Currently, he is responsible for education policy at Policy Exchange, which is an educational charity, and he is often on our screens as a political commentator. In that role, Calvin is often engaging in difficult conversations in which people have different perspectives and then naturally may disagree. He recently came to the attention of Not the Easy Way when he coped well with a difficult interaction in which it was implied that Calvin should think and act in a certain way because of his race. We hope that he can help the listeners today to be able to manage the difficult conversations that they may encounter in their lives and in their communities. Without further ado, I want to welcome Calvin Robinson to the Not the Easy Way podcast. Welcome.
Dr. Peter, Dr. Claire, thank you very much for the invitation. It's lovely to be here.
It's lovely to have you here with us, Calvin.
So we thought what we'd do is we'd start off with a little bit of an icebreaker. I give you a would you rather. Okay? Is that okay, Calvin?
Absolutely, go for it.
So, would you rather spend 365 days, a whole year, on an island alone, or with someone that constantly talks? And when I say constantly, I mean constantly. I mean as you sleep, as you eat, as you go and hunt fish. That person is there by your side, talking constantly.
I think I would rather spend a year by myself than with someone who would not stop talking. But I'm quite a lone ranger. I do like my own personal space. I like to have somewhere quiet to shut down at the end of the day, at the end of a busy day. Otherwise I would go crazy.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I get that.
Calvin, I'm going to start off by asking you to share your thoughts really about how easy or difficult it is, you think, at the moment to have those difficult conversations that may be around complex or contentious issues where there are differing viewpoints. What do you think the current climate is, and how easy is it to have those conversations at the moment?
Dr. Claire, I think it's incredibly difficult at the moment to have any conversation around any hot topic. And I think that's because people have become entrenched. Society's so polarized at the moment. You're either on this camp or that camp. You know, you're on that side or this side with every single topic. It doesn't seem like we have any middle ground anymore. We seem to have lost a sense of nuance. And I think it's up to all of us to regain that and to re-engage, which is why things like this is so important, to have conversations and to learn to respect other people's points of views. And I think it does come down to respect, because quite often, you know, I'm in politics myself, and quite often in politics, we all want the same thing at the end of the day. We all want this country to be a better place, or the world to be a better place, but we have different ideas on how to get there. That's the only difference between the political parties. No one is truly evil. No one is truly bad. It's not good versus bad. It's just different ideas to make the place better for everybody. And I think we forget that quite often. If we showed respect to our opponents more often and thought, yeah, they do want to achieve the same goals that we want, they just have different angles of getting there, then we'd all come at it from a better position.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about it not being between good and bad, because that does often, that seems to what it comes down to, isn't it? That it's viewed that people that think like me, whichever side that might be on, are the good people, and we need to defend our righteousness, and I think often that kind of comes into it against people who might think differently. It's interesting you use the word respect though, because I know was it Cambridge Union a couple of months ago, didn't they had a vote on whether they should respect other views or tolerate I think it was the wording that was going to be used, wasn't it? And it actually came down to tolerating. So even if you decide you can't respect another person's view, it's an important value to think that we should tolerate that. And I think, that's maybe some of that tolerating is being lost.
I was just going to say, I think we hit the nail on the head there with the whole right versus wrong thing, because we assume that our view is right because we hold it, and we feel like we're morally superior because we hold that view, and we don't think we're bad people automatically, usually. So by default, we assume that the opposing viewpoint is wrong or bad. And I think we have to second guess ourselves more and think, actually, am I wrong in this? Am I, coming at this in the right approach? Is there a better way? And maybe we'll take a few things from the opposition's argument. Maybe we won't, but if we question ourselves, that's the right approach, I think, rather than assuming everyone who opposes us is bad or evil, because that's not the case, clearly.
So I suppose you're kind of saying that actually by not having those conversations and not challenging that view of good versus evil, we might actually miss out on something. We might miss out on learning something, or actually, I suppose, having a conversation that brings about a new understanding of something as well.
Absolutely, because as Dr. Clare said, we need to tolerate different views, and that's how we learn whether our views are right or wrong ourselves, and that's how we learn to improve our views or to get a better way of articulating what we want to say in our argument. And if we are putting forward something that we think will make something better for someone, whether that's politics or anything else, if we're trying to make improvements in the world, we want to put our argument across as articulate as possible. And to do that, we have to understand the pros and the cons of our argument in order to persuade people that our way is the better way to do it.
Yeah,
because it's interesting that the idea that we should challenge ourselves about our position, constantly reflecting on our own position around, well, why would somebody think a different way? And maybe they have got something that I would learn from that. Maybe I am wrong. But that can only be done, really, can't it, by having those, what we're terming difficult conversations, but by exposing yourself to those differing viewpoints and considering them and actually weighing them up.
We have to do that ourselves. We can't expect other people. We can't say, why are they not listening to my view? Why aren't they understanding my argument? We have to understand theirs. That's the only way this works.
So it's almost understanding first, and maybe there's a tendency to try to get other people to understand what I'm saying first. But you're kind of saying listen and understand first, and then move from there, maybe. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's how we avoid arguing a different point to what someone else is suggesting. So we often argue past each other. I could be saying something and the person I'm arguing with is saying something completely different, and we're not understanding the core premise of what each other's saying, so we're never going to reach a compromise. So if we actually stop and listen and take on board their points, that's the best way to kind of really truly understand what they're saying and get our message across in reverse.
Yeah. And I suppose I was wondering, Calvin, can you think of a time where you faced a difficult conversation or had to engage in a difficult conversation topic? And would you mind kind of telling us about that and how maybe you've used some of the things that you've described just now to navigate that effectively?
Yeah, just this week I recorded a documentary for Sky Television with the brother of Stephen Lawrence. And obviously this is around race, and this is obviously a very emotive topic anyway. People get very passionate about the debate. But I was recording this with a person of national interest, or a story of national interest. And I have to remember that just because I have a personal stake in this, and just because I have a personal opinion, doesn't mean it's right. And therefore, I have to come at it with an element of compassion, because it's an argument, or it's a conversation that brings up feelings in people anyway. And when it's a topic that's gained national attention and it's around people's lives and lost lives, it's even more emotive than usual. So it's coming at this from a point of not just understanding but empathy, and trying to consider what the opposition might be feeling, not just what they understand the argument to be, before putting your argument across. And that is very difficult, because when all sides are passionate about what they believe, it's very difficult to kind of bring it down a level, but I think that's very important.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting what you've said, Calvin, because I suppose it's the idea that when we're coming to these conversations, especially around difficult topics and emotive topics, I suppose what you're saying is that it's important to really acknowledge where that other person is at in that moment, what emotions they might be feeling. And so we might want to share our view or our perspective, but we also need to be mindful of how that might be received, and how I suppose how we need to phrase things, and and the way in which we say things. And I suppose with that said, I wondered, is there a tension there? Is there a difficulty when actually sometimes we have a view that might be received in an uncompassionate way?
Absolutely, I think there is. So another instance, I was on a radio debate not too long ago. You mentioned it in your introduction, and the person I was arguing with, we were on completely different planes. We were coming at the argument from a completely different level, and it was getting quite heated, quite passionate. And I think, I mentioned compassion, but it's also important to not let the passion turn into anger, and to monitor that. So I thought that I came across quite cross, quite angry in that video, in my response, because I felt like I was being shut down, and I felt like my opponent was using ad hominem attacks. I thought they were being racist towards me, and in that moment I could no longer consider their perspective and where they were coming from and why they were so upset, why they were feeling so emotive about the argument. All I could see was my red line, and my red line was, they've crossed the barrier from arguing facts, figures, data into being personal, and it felt like a personal attack on me. Therefore, my stance was to shut down that debate. I'm no longer happy to have that conversation. So there is a point where we absolutely need to find the middle ground and try to engage in an area that we can both share a language and share a level of passion without it getting too heated. But at the same time, we have to have sensible red lines where if the debate is reaching a point where actually nothing's going to be gained from this because it's gone too far, it's better to walk away than to take it to an extreme.
It's interesting there, because you've talked in those two different examples both about the emotion that comes into discussing these complex and different issues where there are possibly very differing perspectives, and just having those differing perspectives can create real emotion on both sides, and you need to be aware of both possibly what you're provoking in somebody else and how far in different situations you might feel is appropriate to go with that, because I think that's something else that you need to think about, because sometimes that can be used to shut down. You're upsetting me, so therefore you mustn't give your point of view, but versus you making that judgment that actually in this situation the sensitivity for this other person means that I do need to think very carefully about how I express this view, how far I go with this, whether I decide this is the time and place to have this conversation in this way.
Yeah, we've lost all sense of common ground once we've reached too much emotion. And I don't believe in censorship, but I believe in self-censorship. So if we think we're triggering or offending someone to a point that they're no longer able to engage with us on a reasonable level, then we need to kind of consider our next point of conversation. And likewise, on the other foot, we have to consider: are we taking offence at what someone's intended to say or what they've actually said? And I think intent comes into it quite often too, in that quite often people aren't trying to offend us, they're trying to put across their view in the only way that they know how, and sometimes the offence can be perceived on our side where maybe it wasn't intended, and therefore again, it's not coming down to that person being bad, it's coming down to bad communication. So maybe readjust the language that we're using in the conversation so that we can again find that common ground, and it can be reasonable and reasoned rather than heated.
I suppose it sounds like actually in order to navigate these conversations you need to have that sense of self-awareness, or at least be supported to think about, where am I in this situation, how am I coming across, and also how am I interpreting what someone is saying to me. And I might be taking that offence, but actually how have they intended it? So I think that's important, but it's also quite tricky at times as well, especially with all that emotion that can come about in these conversations.
Yeah, and I think having so self-awareness is a perfect way of putting it, because quite often people say to me, how do you maintain your calmness during all of these heated debates with all these, people with extreme views? How do you do that? And I think it's because I know my opinion, and if someone else wants to hear it, they'll have to, calm down, quiet down, and listen to it. I'm not going to shout it at them. I'm not going to push my opinion on anybody, because I already know what it is. I don't need to shout it. I don't need to voice it unless someone's willing willing to hear it and willing to engage with me on it. So quite often I will sit back and stay quiet until that person has vented everything that they've needed to get off their chest, and then are willing sometimes to hear my perspective. But quite often they're not. Quite often people don't actually want to debate, they just want to vent, they just want to get something off their chest, and they want someone to listen to it, and they want to feel heard. And that has to be okay sometimes too.
I think that links to one of the things that Peter and I have been talking about a lot, and we have a speak charter, and one of the kind of top things with that is, what is the aim or the purpose of having the conversation, which really relates to what you said. And if the aim is to try and move towards a shared understanding and respect and tolerance of each other, then thinking about how you're triggering emotion or responding to what people have said or shouting people down, then you've moved away from any of those aims that could be around shared understanding. So, Calvin, having said that, what would your advice be to young people if they were listening to this and thinking, yeah, I've been trying to have conversations around some of these issues. They seem to go in the way that you're describing, where either I'm getting I get very offended by what people say, and so I don't want to speak to them, or conversely, I try and tell people what I think, but they shout me down. What advice would you give to them to try and take this approach that you're advocating?
I think the best advice I could give is to focus on the facts, the data, the information. Try and look for the truth in an argument. Try to take your emotion out of it. I know that's very difficult, but try to take your emotion out and forget about what you feel and talk about what you know. And the best way to not take offense or to not cause offense is to not try to persuade people. Share your information with them and let them share theirs with you. It's not about winning via persuading, because that very rarely happens when you're trying, because it comes across as you're trying to force your views on someone else. Just share the facts, the information, and the truth with the other person, and let them do the same to you.
There's almost a safety there in essence, because you're saying, let me look at the information, let me look at the facts and the evidence, and then let me share that. And it isn't for me to persuade you to think differently, because actually that can be quite emotional, really. If I'm trying to persuade someone to think a certain way and then they're not thinking the way I want them to think, actually that could be quite frustrating.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, I think one of our strengths is admitting when we're wrong, and people think it's a weakness, but it's such a strength in a debate. If you hear something that proves you wrong and you admit to that, that gives so much strength to your argument, because people appreciate that you are actually arguing for the truth and you're actually trying to put across all of the data, the information and the facts to help improve the case that you're putting forward, and you're not just pushing an emotive stance that you happen to believe, and therefore you're not willing to compromise in any way, shape or form. So admitting when you're wrong, and even apologizing if it's an offense that you've caused in being wrong, and then if you're on the other end of that argument, forgiveness, of course. If someone says or does something wrong, if somebody apologizes, the next step is always to forgive.
I wonder whether one of the issues that maybe you're experiencing in the beginning, when you were saying that these conversations, it's becoming increasingly difficult to have these conversations, is that this idea of truth and presenting facts to each other, that there's people don't necessarily want to engage in that listening to you, that exchange of, this is something that I understand and presenting some facts, versus something, well, this is actually something I understand, and presenting those facts and then considering those. And I think one of the ways that, again, going back to the kind of the speak chart and lots of the things that you're saying, thinking, yes, those are things on our speak charter that we produce for young people to use in schools to support them, is to, and you mentioned it in the beginning, Calvin, is to really listen to what the other person's saying. So have your, be ready with your explanation, but actually listen to what they're saying. And one of the key things that we thought about when we were doing the speak charter is ask them questions to build your understanding of what they're saying. So really listen, and then if you're thinking, but that doesn't make sense to me because I think in this way, well, ask them some questions to explain why they think that. So they might just present the facts, but then ask more questions. So spend time listening and exploring what they think.
I love that, Dr. Claire. The asking of questions is so key, because so often people argue something with me, or at me rather, and they say, so you're saying this and you're saying that and you mean this, and actually I didn't say that or mean that, and they've come to an assumption without clarifying it first. It's so much easier to just say, did you mean this, or this might have been interpreted in this way, is that what you intended it to be? And then you can say no, and you can clarify, and you can say, actually, this is what I'm coming at. And I think you also touched on, what people understand, and I think that's important to address, because we often feel things and we understand things through our feelings, and then we come to our own, what we now call our truths. People say my truth is this, through their own personal lived experiences, but it's also important to remember that there is a universal truth, that our truths might have been swayed by our lived experiences, by our personal experiences, but they might not be what everyone else perceives to be the truth. So asking these questions helps us address that, and again comes back to, are we maybe wrong? Are we perhaps wrong on some part of what we believe to be our truth?
So the asking of questions both helps us get nearer understanding both that my truth, somebody's personal lived experience, and the truth, that kind of shared experience that we can all acknowledge, because you can ask questions to build your understanding of what somebody else has actually gone through, how they interpret the world, and that's vital if you're going to come to any shared understanding.
Calvin, I was going to mention as well, similar to what you've said about this difference between universal truth, which I get a sense from you is around kind of evidence, data, facts, and then this lived experience truth. And I suppose I just wondered, from your perspective and your experience, have you ever come across a time when actually someone prioritized lived truth more than this universal truth of facts, data?
I think that's when you meet a deadlock. That's when the conversation can no longer go any further. So quite often, one of the biggest debates I've had recently is around institutional racism in the UK. Right, so there was a big independent report commissioned by the government to look into racial disparities in the UK, and it was looking into actual individual racial disparities to see if there was any instances of racism there. It did find some, and it addressed them, and it provided solutions for them. But in this research, it didn't find any evidence of institutional racism in the UK, the idea that racism in this country is structural. It's not to say that it isn't, it just didn't find any evidence of that. Now, people have argued with me saying the report is actually null and void because they know through their own personal lived experiences that this country is racist. Therefore, all the suggestions in the report should not be listened to. They should all be ignored. It should be disregarded. And that's where you meet a deadlock, because my argument would be, okay, so you might have experienced racism personally, as have I. That's an individual experience, but that doesn't mean that institutionally or systemically or societally that this country is racist. So there's a difference between an individual experience and a societal or a bigger picture experience. And not everyone's willing to accept that. Sometimes people think that their own personal lived experience is the experience for everyone else. And unless they can get past that, you can't really debate. You can't show them facts and evidence because they're not willing to hear it. That's why it's so important for us to all take on board facts and evidence, because we have to be the better debaters. We have to take that all on board.
Can I ask you a question, Calvin? That when you're the advice that you're giving and describing, and this approach to remaining calm, kind of detaching from the emotion, trying to build understanding, all those things you described, how easy do you find it to do that? Is it something that comes naturally to you, or is it something that you've had to work on and develop?
I think it's a talent I developed through living in an all-female household, just letting everyone else bicker amongst themselves, and I'll just sit there and eat my dinner. It is. I've always wanted to be a good listener. I've always practiced listening. I think it's such an important skill, because quite often you'll notice at dinner parties or in groups when you're hanging with your friends or whatever, quite often people just they've got something they want to say and they really want to say it, and people don't always feel heard. So having that skill of being able to just sit there and listen and hear what other people are saying without necessarily having to put your own opinion into it is so helpful to other people. And people don't always want advice either. People just sometimes literally just want to talk and tell you something. So that's what I've grown up trying to do and practicing. And I think that's helped me with my debates, because it links into what I said earlier, that, I already know my opinion. When someone's ready to hear it, I'm happy to share it. But until that point, I'm happy to take on board theirs, whether I think they're right or wrong, because it helps me shape mine even further.
Yeah. So I suppose what you're saying there is that you're able to kind of judge that situation and say, is this a situation in which someone just wants to be heard, or someone wants to vent, or someone wants to be listened to, maybe because they haven't been listened to? And when is this a time when actually, this is an opportunity for me to share information or share a different perspective? So you're kind of approaching those situations and weighing up, or maybe not weighing up, but you're approaching those situations and considering what's the best way to be in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of it is listening to the context and the words, but some of it is reading the emotional stance of the person you're talking to, and how they're feeling about what they're saying.
Just coming back to one of your red lines, or one of the boundaries you have, and you said used a term called ad hominem, which is the idea that when we don't critique someone's ideas or someone's perspectives, we actually attack them as a person for having that idea or having that view. So I suppose I just wondered, that's your boundary. How do you know when a conversation is veering into ad hominem territory, and what do you do? What do you do then? Because I think the listeners would really benefit from that, because I think that's quite something that quite often happens.
I think it tends to happen when someone's not actually confident in their own arguments. Like, they believe something, but they don't know why they believe it, and they don't have the facts or the data to back it up, and they have nothing to put forward to you to persuade you or to tell you about their belief. So instead, they veer into the personal attack and look at your physical characteristics or something about you and attack that instead of the idea that you're putting forward. And that tells me that they're at a point where it's not actually worth engaging, because this conversation isn't going to go anywhere. They're not going to get anything from it, neither are you. That's the point that I walk away. So if it's on social media, I will engage with most people, and I'm so happy for people to tell me when I'm wrong, because I want to learn, I want to get better. I'm happy to hear that I'm wrong. But if someone attacks me personally, I will just instantly block them. I have no time for that negative energy. If someone wants to attack me as a person, they're not going to engage with me in a good way. People need to engage with best practice or with good intentions, otherwise there's no point.
Calvin, you've described a couple of times, you said that you're confident in knowing what you think. So, so you're quite ready for when someone wants to hear that, you're ready to share that with them. But you're also, naturally a good listener, and you recognise the value in listening to others. In doing that, do you feel that have you changed your mind through being open and listening? And do you actively put yourself in positions to seek out other viewpoints? And how difficult do you find that difficult to be exposed to views that are quite different from your own? And how do you feel when you come across that? And has it actually recently changed your view in any way?
Yes, so I did a radio interview on talk radio recently with the presenter was quite left-leaning in his politics. I'm quite right-leaning in my politics, but we're friends and we had a good conversation. And at certain points I said, actually, I hadn't seen it from that perspective. I get your point there. And on other points he said, yes, I see where you're coming from, Calvin. There was some give and take in the argument, and we weren't just trying to push our own views forward. And we didn't necessarily change our minds on our overall view, but there's elements of it that we'd actually adjusted slightly. And to me, that's what good debate is. As for your question, do I seek it out? Absolutely. Oh my gosh. There's nothing I love more than a challenge. And it's surprisingly difficult, because in my area of work, most of the people that want to talk to me already share my opinions. And I find that so boring, because I don't want to talk to people that already know what I know and think what I think. I want to talk to people who can challenge what I think. And as I said earlier, that's what helps improve my argument and change my views for the better. I find it exciting when someone wants to debate with me in a charitable way, in a good way, without ad hominems. Nothing I enjoy more. So yes, I seek it out, but it's very difficult.
We started, the first question was about, how easy or difficult do you think it is nowadays? And you kind of said it's incredibly difficult because of this polarization, this good-bad dynamic. Why do you feel it's getting worse? And if so, why? And how optimistic do you feel that we can that there are people having the sorts of conversations that you want to have and thinking the way you think to get it moving back in the other direction?
I think it is getting worse because of this whole idea of no platforming, which started in the students' unions of all places. This idea that if someone says something that you find offensive, you shut them down and you don't engage with them, you don't debate with them because they're naturally wrong and they're evil and bad. Whereas, as we've discussed in this chat, the best thing to do is to challenge views and debate them and find out, okay, they might be wrong, but to engage with them and let them know why they're wrong. But you also might learn elements about them that are not wrong and that you want to take on board. And free speech is the key to an open, thriving democracy, in my opinion. So we should always have access to open and free debate, and that should be in education, especially in academia, in higher education. It should be a safe space, so to speak, to debate with anyone about anything. Because if you can't do it there, where can you do it? And we say some views are too extreme or some views are too bad to talk about. Well, how do we know that unless we've debated them, unless we've had those conversations? How do we know that these conversations are too bad to be had? So for me, freedom of expression, free speech is absolutely key, the fundamental of everything that we believe in a democracy.
You raise an important point. I just wondered, why might young people today, in your opinion, why might young people today maybe not agree with that, not agree that free speech and freedom of expression is really, really important in society? I just wondered what your kind of thoughts on that were.
So like we talked about offence earlier, and some people genuinely believe that if something is offensive, it shouldn't be said. But the problem there is that offence is so subjective that anyone could be offended by anything if they choose to take offence. Some things are obviously much more offensive than others, but sometimes it's not the case that it's obvious, and it comes down to, for me, intention or the intent of the person making the statement. So if someone is trying to be offensive or they're using a term in a derogatory way, of course that is a different conversation than when someone is just using their natural everyday language and someone happens to find it offensive. That's a very different scenario, and we don't seem to have a differentiation between the two anymore. We kind of bracket all offence into one bubble and say that's offence is bad, we mustn't do it. And again, we don't know if something's offensive or not unless we have a conversation about it. So that's why we have to debate these things and say, is this offensive or is it just offensive to some people? Does that matter? Is that important? If it is, fair enough. But we need to engage with it first and foremost.
Okay, so I think we'll leave that there now. Thank you, Calvin, so much for your time, for coming in and having this important conversation with us around supporting young people to have these difficult conversations around complex issues. We feel it's an important thing for us to think about and to promote for young people, and we really appreciate you giving your time to come and support young people with us. So thank you so much. If anybody wants to find you or follow you, how can they do that?
Dr. Claire, Dr. Peter, thank you for the invitation. It's been fantastic. It's been really good to talk to you. If people want to follow me, just Google Calvin Robinson. You can find me on Twitter, Telegram, Facebook, whatever. Just Google
You'll
me.
just come up. Yeah. Google you. Okay, that's great. Okay. Thank you once again, Calvin. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Calvin.